Before I get into the content of chapter 2, I'd like to say a few words about what I covered last time. And I hope that if you were not with us last time, and I know some of you guys were not able to be with us last time, I hope that you were able to watch the video of the presentation because there's no way that I can sum it all up in a few quick slides. But I'll try to say a few I'll make a few comments about what I think is really important. And so let me just go ahead and jump in. And much of what I'm going to be doing tonight, again, is just reading. So to begin, C.S. Lewis embraces what we would call the classical view of reality and also of education, because the classical view of education, which is profound, is subsumed under the classical view of reality. These things go together. This classical view of reality and of education presumes that a human person is a small part of a much larger and ordered web of relations, so that a proper understanding of a person necessarily conceives him or her in relation to all else that exists. Now, of course, what that means is, if we're Christians, is that we believe God is the sum total of all reality. And so to know reality properly, we must know God and all things in relation to God. That is the Christian understanding of this classical view. So moreover, the classical aim of educating a person is to properly order him or her to all that exists. So knowing the truth from a classical perspective is not standing off as an objective observer and sort of mastering all that exists. Rather, it is simply to be properly ordered to all that exists, so that we see things in their right relation. We love things to the order that they are to be loved. Our affections, our knowledge, all of these things can be assimilated.
Bryan, you're muted.
Your screen is muted. There, it's off.
Is that better?
Sorry, I don't know what happened.
Okay, that's all right. When did I lose you guys? Anybody know?
Just about 4 seconds ago.
Okay. All right. Well, I apologize. Here I go again. All right. So I think I can start right after this first paragraph. That's what I'm going to do. Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. Lewis writes The Abolition of Man as a purely philosophical text. He does not bring his Christian faith into it. It's often said that philosophy is a kind of handmaiden to theology. And for Lewis, The Abolition of Man really does work that way. It's perfectly fine to suggest places where we can anticipate how his Christian faith would have sort of filled in his thoughts. And I'll do that from time to time. And so that's what I'm doing right now. Lewis believes, like Paul, that God is the one in whom we live and breathe and have our being. In other words, God is not, according to the classical tradition, according to Scripture, and according to all Christians, God is not one being among other beings of greater power and proportion, kind of like the Monty Python God, out in the universe with a big beard, God is instead what Thomas Aquinas calls the act of being itself, or the ground of all being. God is not even a being. God transcends being. And so God is the one in whom we live and breathe and have our being. Lewis believed also that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, and that he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross. And so our Christian ancestors insisted that the ultimate end or goal of a human life is to become properly situated or ordered in Christ, who is the source, substance, and end of all that is. Jesus Christ, and our life as Christians, which are supposed to be abiding in Jesus Christ, properly orders us to reality itself. So that to be a Christian and ultimately to be sanctified is to come into the light of Christ, which means to see all things as Christ would see them, to love as Christ would love. Again, to be properly oriented. That's why in 1 John, for instance, Jesus says, you cannot know God if you don't love, because love is a way of knowing God. It's a way of being assimilated to God. So for this reason, Lewis insists on page 14 through 15 that until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. There are, again, proper ways to be ordered to the world and improper ways to be ordered to the world. The fact-value distinction, then, is embraced by Gaius and Titius, and it isolates a person. The fact of his existence, what we'd call the observable is not accompanied by any obligation or the indemonstrable ought to his environment. A person in this view is detached and autonomous and not necessarily ordered by and to a greater whole. And so Gaius and Titius have embraced the Enlightenment view of the individual as a detached and autonomous unit who is able to stand outside of the world and act as an objective critic and observer. And so from this perspective, the proper education of such a person is concerned only with helping him or her to acquire objective and detached knowledge of the observable reality. Now, all value distinctions derive, therefore, from the person internally and uncritically, so that all people can be expected simply to do what is right in their own eyes. To detach a person from an ordered whole is to deny the Tao and embrace moral relativism. And what Lewis argues in chapter 1 is that when we stop attempting to educate people by properly forming their sentiments, by showing them what deserves our love and how we should go about loving things or not loving things, when we stop making that a part of the educational process, then we stop forming people in the kinds of virtues that are necessary to pursue a just and properly ordered world. And so he says we ultimately end up making men without chests. And what that means for Lewis is that we produce people who have no virtue, and yet we demand virtue of each other all the time. And so he says we castrate the gelding and bid him be fruitful, which is what we do to people in our own age. Now, I want to go ahead and talk about chapter 2. If anyone has any questions about this quick review, please don't hesitate to send them to Beth Ann. But I'm going to go ahead and jump into chapter 2. Lewis begins chapter 2, which he titles The Way, with this statement. He says, the practical result of education in the spirit of the Green Book, in other words, in the spirit of this fact-value distinction, where all value judgments, all sentiment are considered subjective and relative and unreal. The result of education in this spirit must be the destruction of the society which accepts it. Now, he won't make that complete, he won't demonstrate that fact or that statement until the end of chapter 3, but he's getting at it here in chapter 2. So remember, the overall argument of the book is that the abolition of man follows this progression. First, man rejects the Tao. Second, of necessity, all value distinctions become subjective so that men become a law unto themselves. And I'll talk about that and how much that really does characterize the world we live in. Third, being supposedly freed from the Tao, certain men will gain the power to subject all other men to their irrational impulses. Whenever we are not collectively under or subject to the Tao, then we live in a world where the strong become stronger and take advantage of the weak, because the strong are subject to nothing. And then fourth, obedience to these irrational impulses or chance. And finally, and as a result, nature's conquest of man. And what he means by that is this: the outcome of this progression is that what we once called men have been reduced to beasts, motivated by animal instinct, the basest of appetites for food and pleasure, for instance, and the will to survive. And so Lewis has a very high view of humankind, and he imagines education and culture and good government and just the moral fabric of the world as a fundamental part of what it means to be human. But what it means to be human is necessarily tied to this idea of a natural law to which we are subject. And so we can no longer be human and have all of those things which make us and help us to flourish if we reject the Tao. So that rejecting the Tao, we just return to a kind of animal instinct, and it is truly the fittest survive. We will gobble each other up in our pursuit of what is best for us. Like at the end of the book of Judges, we all do what is best in our own eyes. So accordingly, here in chapter 2, Lewis sets out to demonstrate that it is irrational to deny the Tao. His argument unfolds, I believe, around 5 basic propositions. And so what I'm going to do tonight is state those propositions clearly, and then offer some quotations from sections of the book that provide evidence or justification or clarification for those particular propositions. And so I'll go ahead and move forward. First, here's proposition 1. Lewis claims that the Green Book, can you guys see the illustration here, by the way? If I did not move this, could you see it, or are we kind of blocking it? Anyway, it's a scientist worshiping a beaker, which is funny, and actually demonstrates the kind of cultural spirit that Lewis himself was engaging at the time that he was writing this in the 1940s. There was a kind of scientism which believed it was purely sort of rational and fact-based, and this was a big problem in the mid-20th century. And so anyway, Gaius and Titius claim to reject values, but they smuggle their own values into their book. And in that way, what they're doing really is hypocritical. And so, for instance, on pages 27 and 28, he writes this: however subjective they may be about some traditional values, Gaius and Titius have shown by the very act of writing the Green Book that there must be some other values about which they are not subjective at all. They write to produce certain states of mind in the rising generations, and if not because they think those states of mind intrinsically just or good, yet certainly because they think them to be the means to some state of society which they regard as desirable. So in other words, they're making an argument, okay? They're trying to persuade people to some end, which is a demonstration of a value. So he goes on, and this end must have real value in their own eyes. They clearly have an agenda. So for the whole purpose, he goes on, of their book is so to condition the young reader that he will share their approval. And we talked about this last time. When we begin to deny the existence of an objective standard of natural law, we cannot help but begin to smuggle those values that we think are most important into the way that we engage the world. We try to convince people to live as we believe they should live, even while denying there is any objective standard according to which we should all live. So what values then, we might ask, do Gaius and Titius want young people to embrace? What are they really trying to achieve? Lewis writes this on page 29. In actual fact, Gaius and Titius will be found to hold with complete uncritical dogmatism the whole system of values which happen to be in vogue among moderately educated young men of the professional classes during the period between the two wars. And so that really could have been a number of things. It could have been fascism, whether we're talking about Germany or France, or even many people in Britain who were sympathetic to movements in Germany and France. There were very popular pre-fascist movements like Action Française in France, for instance. And many people who claimed to believe in no God, who were rejecting Christianity, were increasingly embracing these, what I would call ideologies. It could have been Marxism, which was popular, extremely popular, between the two wars. It could have simply been what we'd call positivism in science, this idea that we really can begin to know all things. We can, as human beings, be confident about our ability eventually to know all the facts of the world, to sort of catalog them and master them, and what we can expect as a result of our conquest of the natural world. And reality itself is a continued kind of progress towards some sort of utopia. So this is what he's talking about. You know, the agenda of Gaius and Titius plays into the hands of all of these kinds of people and their various ideologies. And so he goes on. This phenomenon, he says, is very usual. A great many of those who debunk traditional, or as they would say, sentimental values, have in the background values of their own, which they believe to be immune from the debunking process. And so the issue with all of the ideologies that we've just described is that they really do claim, they're making a claim, and they presume to have a handle on the real, on what is actually true. In fact, in the 20th century, there was a tendency, this was a tendency in the 19th and the 20th century, to create sort of histories of the world, which presume that our ancestors were largely undeveloped. So that history is this gradual sort of evolution, which has always been heading to now. And now is the sort of scientific age, or the enlightened age, or finally the fully just age. We now, for the very first time, know everything that needs to be known to put ourselves to right. We finally have it figured out. This was an important part of all of the sort of utopian visions, whether they be Marxist utopian visions or whether they be the vision of Auguste Comte in France. Even Nazism sort of has this Nietzschean sort of view that this better world is just around the corner, because we have gotten to the point in history where we have evolved out of our childhood. Okay, so thus this is the hypocrisy. Gaius and Titius are making an argument. They're making an argument, and insofar as they make an argument, they are proposing something that they believe to be of great value. And this leads to thesis number 2 for Lewis. And he calls this, and it's misspelled in the presentations if you downloaded them, the experimentum crucius. From the view of the Green Book, which just means the crucial experiment. In Lewis's mind, this particular test case is the key one. Okay, this one will really sort of bear out the point that he's trying to make. He says, from the view of the Green Book, how can it ever be argued? In other words, what reason can be given that some men should lay down their lives for the greater good? Now, we have to remember that Lewis was writing this during the height of World War II. This book was published in 1943. And so you have to understand again that the people to whom he was speaking, and he was giving this series of addresses up at St. Andrews College. And no, he was at the University of Edinburgh. No, he's at Durham. I'm sorry. These are all Scottish. He was at the University of Durham. And he was giving this series of addresses to a group of people who had a tremendous amount to lose. And just about every British family knew some young man who was willingly sacrificing himself somewhere on the battlefields of Europe. And so he finds an argument here, which is certainly going to have an appeal to the people that he's talking to. And so he's basically turning this on Gaius and Titius, or the actual authors of the Green Book. And he's saying, are you able at all to make the case that these young men should be doing what they are doing over, on the battlefields in Germany or in France? Is there any justification you can offer? How can you justify their sacrifice? And then he goes on. By the logic of Gaius and Titius, every appeal to pride or honor or shame or love is excluded by hypotheses. In other words, an argument must be free of any values, stating only the facts. And what he wants to demonstrate is that no argument can be made at all if we stick only to the facts, because reason itself requires values. Any conception of reason requires values. They're simply built in. So, in the end, he says, a refusal to sacrifice oneself is no more rational than a consent to do so, from the perspective of the Green Book, and no less rational. From propositions about fact alone, no practical conclusion can ever be drawn. This will preserve society cannot lead to do this except by the mediation of society ought to be preserved. In other words, this will preserve society must have the ought of value. Okay. All right. Then he continues. Reason requires values. We must therefore either extend the word reason to include what our ancestors called practical reason, or phronesis. This was a Greek word, by the way, which referred to what he calls practical reason. And it's the idea that reason itself finds itself within this ordered web of relations, and that there are actually practical actions required in the context of particular relations. And so phronesis simply describes a kind of wisdom which knows how to act in relation to the right circumstances. Okay, phronesis. This is to be contrasted with the other Greek word techne, which is a kind of it's a more sort of fact-based kind of reasoning that just observes cause and effect. Okay, I'll start again. We must therefore either extend the word reason to include what our ancestors called practical reason, phronesis, and confess that judgments such as society ought to be preserved are not mere sentiments but are rationality itself. That's a strong statement. These are rationality itself. Or else we must give up at once and forever the attempt to find a core of rational value behind all the sentiments we have debunked. The innovator, and that's what he calls Gaius and Titius, and it's not a compliment, because they're trying to smuggle in some new values while denying they're actually values. The innovator will not take the first alternative, for practical principles known to all men by reason are simply the Tao, which he has set out to supersede. So Lewis then invites us to consider what reason, apart from the Tao, can be given that some men should lay down their lives for the greater good. And this leads to proposition number 3, which is simply that instinct is insufficient. Okay, and I'll explain, and you've read that Lewis goes to the issue of instinct. He writes, because the conditioners cannot accept the Tao as a reason for self-sacrifice, they search for some more basic and realistic ground. Generally, they claim to find this ground in instinct. Now, he was just anticipating here that is what Gaius and Titius would do, but he was anticipating based upon his observation of what people were actually doing at the time. And this was profoundly prophetic, because this is exactly the argument that people make today. And I'll talk about what they call it today. Instinct is not always the word used, but that's precisely what sort of the popular morality of our world appeals to. So Lewis defines instinct as an unreflective or spontaneous impulse widely felt by the members of a given society. And so again, it's unreflective. It's not something we've had the chance to think about. Now remember, from the perspective of the Green Book, all value distinctions derive from the person internally and uncritically, so that all people can be expected simply to do what is right in their own eyes. We just act based upon what we want, okay? And we pursue what is instinctual to pursue. Today, of course, we call this expressive individualism. It is the equivalent of the contemporary mantras, you do you, be true to yourself, live and let live, etc. Now, I'd actually invite you to Google expressive individualism. This would be worthy of a lecture in and of itself. I've actually done presentations for the C.S. Lewis Institute on the issue of identity politics. The whole issue of identity politics is sort of grounded in an anthropology of expressive individualism, where the human being is a kind of individual unit and is defined entirely by what resides on the inside, and primarily by passions or by desires. This is the kind of Oprah Winfrey, and I mean no slight to Oprah Winfrey, or maybe I do. It's the kind of philosophy of Oprah Winfrey. You do you, be true to yourself, and you can of course see it in the gay marriage agenda. You can see it in the transgender agenda. You can see it in again, various forms of identity politics, whether they be LGBTQ identity politics, where people are becoming, or even sort of white nationalism or Black Lives Matter, where people increasingly are identifying themselves by something internal to themselves, their own personal needs, desires, drives. It is leading to a kind of tribalism, where it's actually what the Nazis called blood and soil. Okay, blood and soil is somewhat similar to this idea of expressive individualism. We are really defined by our instinctive animal nature. Okay, there's again a lot more we could say about this, but this is the way of the world we live in right now. And of course, you guys know that there's a kind of almost soft totalitarianism that is emerging right now, where corporations are lining up and our government is lining up to ensure that that everyone have the right to be true to themselves. But of course, if being true to yourself in any way comes into conflict with another person's right to be true to themselves, we find ourselves at an impasse. And it's really hard to see where that's all going to lead, but it certainly represents a breakdown. Okay, so Lewis makes 3 arguments against the claim that instinct can replace practical reason. Expressive individualism does not work and certainly cannot replace the Tao. First, he says, those who appeal to instinct, who affirm that we must be true to ourselves, still make arguments on behalf of instinct. Okay, so be true to yourself, but I'm going to convince you, okay, to pursue or obey the instinct that I believe you should pursue or obey. The argument that a person must make must appeal to something beyond instinct, something on the outside. In other words, you have to use reason. Why? Well, it is maintained that we must obey instinct, that we cannot do otherwise. But if so, why are green books and the like written? Okay, in other words, why are we trying to convince each other if it's all just instinct? We don't need to convince anyone. It should be as natural as a cheetah running fast to catch a warthog. For some reason, I watch that kind of thing almost every night on my iPad. Anyhow, that's a fact you guys don't need to know. Moreover, in the case of self-sacrifice, the innovator would have to say not that we must obey instinct, nor that it will satisfy us to do so, but that we ought to obey it. How about that? We ought to obey it. But why ought we to obey instinct, okay? In other words, we are right back where we started if we accept the fact-value distinction. You cannot get an ought from an is from within the fact-value distinction. Now, please, if you have any questions or if you need clarifications, don't hesitate to send a chat message to Beth Ann. In a room full of people, we would certainly be having a discussion right now. Second, we have competing instincts, okay? Instincts don't work because we have competing instincts. And the kind of tribalism, again, that we see in the world today is a good example of the fact that we have competing instincts. And the mere fact of existence, or the mere fact or existence of these instincts, says nothing about their value or about their worth. So telling us to obey instinct is like telling us to obey people. People say different things. So do instincts. Our instincts are at war. I think that's obvious enough. We don't have to say more about that. The idea that without appealing to any court higher than instincts themselves, we can yet find grounds for preferring our instinct above its fellows dies very hard. We grasp at useless words. We call it the basic or fundamental or primal or deepest instinct. You know, find you, be true to you, whoever you are. That's your deepest truth. That's actually another phrase we hear a lot. It is of no avail. Either these words conceal a value judgment passed upon the instinct and therefore not derivable from it, or else they merely record its felt intensity, the frequency of its operation, and its wide distribution. Now, what he's saying there is that all we can really do if we embrace the fact-value distinction that Gaius and Titius embrace is observe people's instincts. We cannot say they are good or right. We cannot say they are wrong. And when we find, of course, that people have competing instincts and are instinctively led to bludgeon one another, all we can do if we embrace this fact-value distinction is just sort of observe, you know, like anthropologists looking at some primitive people. We cannot get an ought from an is. Third, there is likely no instinct to sacrifice oneself for the greater good. Lewis writes, what we have by nature is an impulse to preserve our own children and grandchildren, an impulse which grows progressively feebler as the imagination looks forward and finally dies out in the deserts of vast futurity. In other words, we do have motherly instincts. Many people do. We have fatherly instincts. We have an instinct to love those who are closest to us. But for some reason, we really also do have a hard time acting and organizing our society and even our basic communal lives in such a way that the people who live 50 years from now or 100 years from now will benefit from the decisions that we make right now. In all kinds of ways, people act to the detriment of the generations which will follow us. And if we had an instinct to preserve the common good or society, we certainly don't live out or act on that instinct. In fact, quite to the contrary, we do not prove that to be the case at all. He goes on to say, as we pass from mother love to rational planning for the future, we are passing away from the realm of instinct into that of choice and reflection. What is absurd, and this is where he really sort of punches this argument in the gut. He says, what is absurd is to claim that your care for posterity finds its justification in instinct, and then flout at every turn the only instinct on which it could be supposed to rest, tearing the child almost from the breast to creche and kindergarten in the interest of progress in the coming race. Now, the creche in Great Britain at the time just refers to a kind of nursery, an organized nursery where a mother herself is not the caregiver. And so what he's saying is the same people arguing for progress and arguing that instinct is what must actually lead us to sacrifice ourselves for our country certainly is not represented in the kind of culture these innovators are calling for, which increasingly is tearing families apart, taking mothers from their children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, instinct simply it does not work in this way for people in Great Britain, at least in 1943. He goes on, the truth finally becomes apparent that neither in any operation with factual propositions, nor in any appeal to instinct, can the innovator find the basis for a system of values. And so in other words, for Gaius and Titius, who reject the Tao, all value statements can be nothing more than mere subjective sentiment. Instinct simply cannot help. You cannot, in other words, make an argument. You cannot give a reason as to why people should sacrifice themselves on the battlefields in World War II. There's just no way you can do it. All right. So here's the fourth proposition. Now that he has debunked the idea of instinct, which people do regularly appeal to. He says, to attack the Tao, we actually need the Tao. Page 41. The innovator attacks traditional values, the Tao, in defense of what he at first supposes to be, in some special sense, rational or biological values. But as we have seen, all the values which he uses in attacking the Tao, and even claims to be substituting for it, are themselves derived from the Tao. Only by such shreds of the Tao as he has inherited is he enabled even to attack it. And if that's unclear, I'll explain it. The Tao, of course, agrees with him about the importance of getting the people fed and clothed. You might think right now about what we'd call social justice warriors in our world. I think many of whom would not be people of faith, okay? Who are extraordinarily passionate about pursuing justice. The Tao agrees with them that justice should be done. The poor should be cared for. Then he goes on, unless the innovator were himself using the Tao, he could never have learned of such a duty. But side by side with it, in the Tao, lie those duties of justice and good faith, which he is ready to debunk. What is his warrant? He may be a jingoist, which is just a kind of extreme nationalist or patriot, somebody who is willing to do violence on behalf of his, it's just sort of a rabid nationalist. A racialist, which is just a racist. You might think of eugenicists, the science of eugenics, which was very popular in the early 20th century, which was sort of selective breeding. And Margaret Sanger, the leader of Planned Parenthood, was among the racialists that he probably has in mind. An extreme nationalist, which is about the same thing as a jingoist, who maintains that the advancement of his own people is the object to which all else ought to yield. He is in fact deriving his values from the Tao. A duty to our own kin is a part of traditional morality, but side by side with it, in the Tao and limiting it, lie the inflexible demands of justice and the rules that, in the long run, all men are our brothers. So there has never been, he goes on to say, and never will be, a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world. What purport to be new systems, or as they now call them, ideologies, all consists of fragments from the Tao itself. Arbitrary, and I love this sentence, arbitrarily wrenched from their context in the whole, and then swollen to madness in their isolation. And so we live in a strange world where, and I don't mean to pick on any particular group, but we really do, and this summer was good evidence of it. People going crazy in the streets, burning cities down in the interest of justice, and pursuing a fragment of the Tao in isolation from the whole, and then that fragment having been swollen to madness. In other words, they have made it the sum total of all things, and they pursue it without, and I'm being general, I'm overgeneralizing here, but without even considering their own relation to goodness or to justice or to the Tao. In other words, it's something we can pursue externally, but not something that necessarily should be expected to reside within us, okay? virtue among those who pursue some fragment of the Tao is hardly considered. And I hope that is clear what I'm arguing right here. It certainly is the case that in the Enlightenment era, which has really sort of led to this fragmentation of the human person, has isolated him or her from this web of ordered relations, which was affirmed by all people prior to the 16th century. As that has broken down, we have in fact retained many fragments of the Tao. We simply don't know how to put them in context any longer. And so the pursuit of justice itself becomes swollen to madness as people pursue their individual sort of pet justice projects, rather than attempting to form virtuous people properly ordered to the whole, so that a society itself can pursue justice, okay, and rightly ordered living. I hope that makes sense again. And so the rebellion of new ideologies against the Tao is a rebellion of the branches against the tree. If the rebels could succeed, they would find that they had destroyed themselves. All right. So here is point 5, proposition 5. The Tao develops from within. After debunking instinct and showing the necessity of the Tao for all value judgments, he asks, does this mean then that no progress in our perceptions of value can ever take place? What he's getting at here is that although we affirm the Tao, and we believe in God, yet we don't believe that we can master him or even completely know him. Classically, people have believed the same about the Tao. There is a natural law to which we are subject. And we, as Christians, certainly know where to find that law. We know how to sort of abide in it, okay? We know what way will keep us sort of, as my wife's dad used to say, no, as my granddad, will keep us between the fences. That's a Texas saying, okay? From a Christian perspective, we know how to stay in the way, even if we cannot sort of master the Tao, okay? And we cannot, because it transcends us. And so let me ask the question again. After debunking instinct and showing the necessity of the Tao for all value judgments, he asks, does this mean then that no progress in our perception of value can ever take place? And the answer, of course, is yes. A progress of perception of the Tao can take place. Our perception of the Tao can make progress, but the Tao admits development from within. And then he offers some examples of that and some demonstrations of what he means. From the confusion, do not do to others what you would not like them to do to you, to the Christian, do as you would be done by, is a real advance, okay? You go from the merely do no harm to the positively do good, okay? You can see that the second proposition is not a contradiction of the first. It's just a fuller development of it. It's as though we've gone from a seedling to a full-blown tree. And that's the way all moral progress, just like all intellectual progress, really should work. Then he goes on. The legitimate reformer endeavors to show that the precept in question conflicts with some precept which its defenders allow to be more fundamental, or that it does not really embody the judgments of value it professes to embody. Only those who are practicing the Tao will understand it. And then I would add, and be able to advance in understanding of it. And so having a handle on its truths, like do not do to others what you would not like them to do to you, can allow us to understand, if we affirm that truth, how an advancement and a development of that truth truly is a development, and yet is not contradicting that original truth. Any advancement in our understanding of the Tao will not contradict what has come before and been built upon, is what Lewis is saying here. All right. So in conclusion, I'm going to just quote Lewis here. I am simply arguing that if we are to have values at all, we must accept the ultimate platitudes of practical reason as having absolute validity. That any attempt, having become skeptical about these, to reintroduce value lower down on some supposedly more realistic basis is doomed. We cannot sneak in any value judgments if we deny a natural law. In other words, any attempt to make the world a better place or increase justice among men must first acknowledge the reality of objective, what we'd call truth, beauty, and goodness. These are classically described as the transcendental perfections, truth, beauty, and goodness. And in Christianity, Jesus Christ shows us all of these. He is the good, he is the beautiful, he is the true. We must acknowledge a standard or a way according to which human life must be conformed. And again, even if we cannot master that way, we acknowledge that it exists, and our lives are spent pursuing a greater understanding of it, knowing where it is to be found, and our lives are spent attempting to conform themselves to it more fully. And so in the next chapter, Lewis will argue that when we reject the Tao and become a law unto ourselves, the necessary outcome is the abolition of man. And this was a common refrain in the mid-20th century, this idea that whenever we not only reject the Tao, not only when we reject natural law, but when we reject God himself, what happens is the destruction of man. And so that's it. I think that pretty well covers the basic arguments of chapter 2. Now we're going to do what we did last week and go into breakout groups. And I'm going to turn this over to Beth Ann and make her the host for a moment so that she can move us into breakout groups. And when we get there, you guys are, of course, why don't we, was 10 minutes enough last time, or would more time be better? Anybody want to thumbs up on 10 or down on 10? I can only see a few people. 10 minutes, okay? All right, we'll just take 10 minutes. And if we can have more discussion when we get back, but you're of course free to talk about whatever you want to talk about. But if you need some discussion pointers, you might consider what questions do you have about the book or the presentation so far? Any clarifications that you need answered? In what ways do you find the argument of the way relevant to the world we live in? And if you don't find it relevant, then you might discuss how it is or how it might be. And so, Beth Ann, I'm going to go ahead and let you break us up.